tutors, mentors, and the city with your host.com.
The City Tutors presents
Tutors, mentors, and the city
with your host.com.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Kevin.com Brown, and welcome to Tutors, Mentors, and the City. I haven't said this in a long time, so I'm going to say it now. When we first named the show, I wanted to name it Tutors, Mentors, and Dragons, right? Because when you put dragons in anything, it makes it way cooler. And nobody liked that. Nobody liked adding dragons. Nobody could wrap their brain around dragons. What is that? Doesn't make any sense. But I thought it was the greatest name in the world. But and I said that when we first started recording, doing this podcast. Please, ladies and gentlemen, let's jump right in, and please help me welcome our guests for this episode, Mr. Gary Bagley. Give it up for Gary. All right. So thank you for joining us, Gary. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing well too. So just to jump right in, Bagley, what kind of name is that?
My understanding is it comes from the British Isles. There are a lot of Bagleys in England. There are a fair amount of Bagleys in upstate New York, which is where I'm from.
Okay. And Gary, is that short for something?
Nope, that's the full name.
Really?
Yeah, Gary used to be short, I understand, for Gerard or Gerald. It used to be something kind of people would use Gary or Jerry.
Yeah.
And then there were a couple famous actors in the 40s and 50s, Gary Cooper being one, and it turned Gary into just a name. And so my mom and dad took it upon themselves to just call me Gary.
My middle name is Ryan.
Yeah.
And my grandmother was a big fan of Robert Ryan.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah, and that's how they threw that middle name in there. And I never used the name Ryan because I always thought it was a girl's name. And there was a long-running soap opera called Ryan's Hope.
Exactly.
And I think that was a female. So I never told anybody what my middle name was. But anyway, so Gary Bagley, who are you?
Well, right now, I am a consultant. I'm an executive coach working with nonprofit leaders. I also teach nonprofit management at Columbia University as well as at Baruch College here in New York City. Before I launched this kind of work, I spent 13 years as the executive director of New York Cares, which is one of the city's largest network of volunteers. And we did everything from college readiness work to working in parks and gardens and working on matters of food equity and food insecurity. So have done a lot of work in the education space across my life. Before New York Cares, I was actually worked in arts education, bringing artists into the public schools. So been a life of working in education.
Okay, so let's rewind. I'm gonna unpack some of those things you said because I was actually asked to speak in a panel panel discussion on food insecurity. Right?
Yes.
Now the request was made by one of the undergrads at my school. I'm a master's candidate at CCNY right now.
Yeah. And
I try to engage with the young people. So anytime they ask me to do anything, I just say yes, right? Right now, I have no special knowledge about food insecurity. So I'm debating with myself to say, I'm going to get that knowledge from Gary right now. But do I get it at the end or do I get it at the beginning? You know what? I spent too much time. I'm going to get it right now. Let's dig into the name of the company was what? City Cares, you said?
New York Cares.
New York Cares. So let's dig into food insecurity. Tell us more about that. That's a thing. That's the modern term for we're really hungry, right? What is tell us more.
Exactly. What's interesting is the term food insecure came up because there are individuals who may have access to some food, but not enough food, or they may have access to food, but not to healthy food, right? So there are those who literally need to get a meal from, whether it's their local food pantry or some other means. But then there are those who also lack access to healthier foods. And that could be because they have a very low income. It could be that where they live, there isn't access to healthier foods, right? There might not be grocery stores, for instance, right, that sell a lot of fruits and vegetables. So, but when we look at food insecurity in New York City, the biggest, I would say, exacerbating factor was the pandemic, right? Where we saw a lot of people either lose their jobs go on pause. A lot of people were able to stay employed, but were underemployed, right? There wasn't enough money coming in to really feed themselves and their families the way that they should. So, I haven't seen the most recent estimates, but, in a city of 9 million people, anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million are considered food insecure. So the food pantries are, frankly, they're really working overtime. During the pandemic, luckily, a lot of people became aware because of unemployment that hunger was probably also an issue for many. And so many of the pantries and kitchens around the city really were able to access larger grants than usual. At New York Cares, we had worked to do a lot of work in that space. In the first year after the pandemic, we delivered somewhere along the lines of 36 million pantry bags or meals to individuals across the 5 boroughs.
Wow. Okay. So, first of all, you you gave me enough already to sound brilliant in this panel discussion.
There you go. Exactly. You don't even have to footnote me. Just say, guess what I know. That's
I'm
all.
gonna say, in my research, I've discovered that.
There you go. Exactly.
No, but that's informative and troubling, right? That's informative and troubling at the same time, because I was just listening to, the political campaigns in Georgia, for example.
Yeah.
Both of these senators spent $200 million each on their campaigns.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I was like, there's got to be a way to run for senator and not have to spend $200 million on ad time and pamphlets. There's so many other things you could have done with that $400 million. And then we're going to have a runoff and you're going to find hundreds more millions. And it's like, what are we doing? What are we doing?
Yeah, no, it's one of the reasons why so many people are passionate about campaign reform, because when the kind of dollars that even a candidate who doesn't have great personal wealth, right, has to raise that kind of money. And then when you have somebody with great personal wealth who can throw an extra few million at this, or billion, depending on the candidate, right? And if we're all judging our decisions on, frankly, on ad time, right, then it becomes a very unlevel playing field, right? Where the wealthier you are, the better the campaign you can run, and therefore the more likelihood that you have a chance to win. So that's one of the reasons a lot of people are so passionate about campaign reform, because it's gotten to the point where somebody has to raise 200 million to be senator. Imagine what happens if you're running for president or governor or some of the other roles here that are so competitive, obviously.
Absolutely. So let's go back for a bit. Let's see what formed your journey. Born and raised where?
Upstate New York, outside Albany. My dad is a blue collar worker. I always say we had, there were 5 kids, and he worked 2 jobs to kind of make sure we were all, mom and the 5 kids were fed and going to school. And, so it was a great upbringing. And during my early years, I actually became, very passionate and engaged in arts myself. I went from Ithaca, and I actually went to music school, or I'm sorry, I grew up in Albany. I went to Ithaca College for music, and then expanded that into an interest in theater. And the two things together brought me to New York City. I think I knew pretty rapidly that they weren't going to be a professional career for me. I loved them. But I spent a few years kind of knocking around, figuring out what I wanted to do. A lot of that led me to teaching. And I started by teaching music and theater to young elementary school, primarily aged kids, through a great program in New York City called Tada, which is still there years later. And that took me on my journey to then eventually running the department, the education area of the organization I'd been working for, Tada, which then led me to a wonderful group called Young Audiences that brings artists into the public schools of all disciplines. And then I was ready to transition outside the arts. I became, as we talk about food insecurity and tutoring and mentoring, I became more concerned, I would say, with the bigger social issues than seeing arts specifically as the vehicle for addressing them. I love the arts. I wanted that to be a part of it. But in that journey, I also went back and got my master's in public administration at Baruch. Interestingly, my next stop was New York Cares, where I was hired as the chief program officer. And about 5 years into my tenure, my predecessor stepped down from her role to go to a new organization. I threw my hat in the ring and was lucky enough to get the job and spent about 13 years as executive director. So that's been the kind of overarching journey that brought me to this, to my living room today to talk to you.
Well, you said a number of things now, but we got to go back. We got to go back now.
Okay.
So public school, private school?
Public, absolutely.
Okay. And siblings, there were 5 of y'all. Where did you come in?
I was number 2.
Number 2. How many boys, how many girls?
2 boys, the oldest. The 2 older are both boys, and then I have 3 younger sisters.
So you had to learn, you had to protect the little girls. You had to protect. I remember, I have a younger sister, and I remember you better bring your, better take care of baby girl.
Right.
Older brother. So he probably threw you in a headlock or gave you a wedgie here or there or whatever.
Absolutely.
Made sure you knew how to present yourself so you don't embarrass him in the.
Exactly.
How much older?
My brother, Ray, the older brother, is just under 2 years older.
Okay. So my older brother's like 3.5 years older than me. So it's old enough to make a difference, but it balances out. It's like negligible at a certain point.
Exactly.
And how much younger are these girls?
We're all very close together. There was a point where my brother, myself, and then the next sister in line, Tammy, were all in high school at the same time. And then when Ray graduated, my sister Colleen came to high school. And so Tammy and Colleen and I were together for 2 years of high school. So we're all very close together. And then the baby sister, Allison, in the days we used to call it an afterthought child. She was, I think, 7 or 8 years younger than Colleen. So none of us went through school with Allison, but she had to go into every school going, oh, I had all your brothers and sisters in class, She was like tired of that routine.
Okay, so you went to college for music. What stimulated this music desire?
It started, and it's it's that probably one of the reasons I cared so much about the arts and education as I was growing up, because, I grew up in a public school system, but, I was able to take, it ended up being saxophone lessons starting in the fourth grade. There was band and chorus and, in every single grade available. And part of that was that I got lessons, with the teacher. Eventually, as I set my sights on something, more ambitious, like thinking of going to college, I started taking private lessons, on the different instruments that I played. But yeah, it started very young age. And, as I think about education and the importance of, call it tutors and mentors in your life, one of the things that I always had in my teachers was, I still remember this in seventh grade, I think I was, maybe sixth grade even, when we were in middle school. I heard somebody reference that a song had been arranged, which I didn't know what that meant at that time. Somebody, teacher explained that it meant the song had been written by somebody else, but, another person brought it alive for orchestra or a band or whatever it might be. And then I just said, can you teach me to do that? Like, I was immediately interested. And they pointed me to a couple books, and somewhere in the seventh and eighth grade, I was like arranging songs for the middle school jazz band and just, really embracing that. But there were people along the way who supported me, so that then by the time I got to high school, I started actually trying to write a few of my own ideas down. I actually started learning to play the piano a little bit because I had to hear what I was writing. And I would stay after school so I could use the piano. So that whole journey eventually just, I guess it made it feel like music was the obvious college major for me. And who knows if that was true or if it was just, I felt a lot of both support, acceptance, recognition coming for that particular talent. And so, that's what I pursued. I was also, worked hard and was lucky that I did very well academically. So, at the same time, I was, very interested in history in particular. And so when I went to Ithaca, I never formally did a double major, but I guess I took enough history credits and anthropology and some other things that I could have, if I wanted, I could have had a double major or a minor in one of those subjects.
Okay, I remember, watching the old school Frank Sinatra concerts, and he would always highlight who arranged this was arranged by so and so. And I never heard the definition you just gave, because I would think that even though someone, broke it down for the band, I would think that the person who writes it is still important. Like, and it's switched.
Yeah. And I think in the recording industry, when we talk about a producer, a lot of producers, I think, take on that role of figuring out what the ultimate sound is going to be. But no, the arrangers, I grew up listening, of course, to musical theater albums, because in the 60s and early 70s, the Broadway, show albums were big hits. Like, people don't realize that. It was like, I think it was West Side Story or My Fair Lady that won the Grammy, like, its best album, right? So it was a very different time. But the orchestrations that were behind that, or the overtures of some of those, I was just fascinated by that. I was fascinated that when they sang it in the musical, it sounded like this, but when it showed up in the overture, it sounded totally different, right? I loved that. I found it so engaging. And, through my life journey, it was funny and interesting that I think I found more pleasure in taking something somebody else wrote and bringing it to life in that way, then I actually enjoyed writing it myself, because I did both. But hearing something in somebody else's composition, and like I said, trying to bring it to life in a different way or give it a different sound, that I loved.
Now, growing up in the arts, kids growing up in music, it's different. They're different.
Yeah.
It creates a different breed of human being. What did you get from the music thing? What was your thing?
Well, I often have told people that one of the reasons I appreciate music and the arts in general is, first, there is a task focus to it, right? Like you learn at a very early age that if you don't practice, you're going to get to your lesson and you're going to sound bad, right? Like that's just what's going to happen. You're not going to get lucky. I mean, maybe once if the material's easy, but there's no luck. And when you're doing a play, if you don't learn your lines, if you don't do some of the basic things, you're just going to stand in front of hundreds of people and look bad. So I think, there is a kind of dedication, a process that we learn that helps people in all areas. Like, musicians tend to be very regulated. They like figure out, what do I have to do? They divide up their time, they get it done, because otherwise they couldn't be a musician. So I think that matters. The other thing a musician has to do, and I think any artist, is you also have to get comfortable being alone, right? Because your art is very public for a very brief amount of time. And then a lot of the work, is sitting 2 or 3 hours a day in a practice room. You have to, there's a sort of a dedication and a willingness to be in that by yourself. That's incredibly important. I think the other reason I have always appreciated the arts is, especially as I worked in more areas where there were not artists, right, is artists simply look at problems differently than the rest of the world, right? And even within the arts, a theater artist versus a musician versus a dancer versus a visual artist, all trying to make sense of the world in a different way. And in education in particular, right, there are a lot of kids who are extremely talented, extremely smart, but not necessarily smart in the math and reading, right, way, but have other great talents. And so I think, in any of the art forms, you learn a way of kind of solving a problem that isn't linear, right? Like in theater, I know, it's, why do we not know if a show is good until it opens? Well, it's because there's only so much you can do, and then you have to see how people react to it, right? And musicians, you can do all the right things and not make magic that night, and then sometimes you do make magic, right? So I think that's always been really important for me, to be able to bring more creative sense into the workplace. I was a musician, so it's a very structured kind of creativity. I'm not like all over the place, but I think those are some of the big things that I took away from it.
Okay, so from the way you describe high school, relatively small, how would you describe it?
Big. Graduated in a class, well, not New York City big. I graduated in a school of 550. My senior class was like somewhere between 550 and 600.
My senior class at Brooklyn Tech had 6,000 graduates.
You went to Brooklyn Tech, right? Exactly. Yeah. So I just realized, like, at the time in the suburbs, everybody's like, "Whoa, that's so many people," right? It's not New York City big.
So go to Ithaca. How would you describe Ithaca? Large, small? What was that?
Ithaca, it's very funny. I was so into the area I was studying in. Somebody once said, how many students go there? And I was like, I really have no idea. I care about the 100 people here in the music school. And so was not that aware, but I think it's kind of a mid-sized campus, maybe 3,000 students or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it didn't involve much of, there was no culture shock. There was not much of a transition from high school to college.
Not a big one. I would say that Ithaca attracted students from a lot of areas that I wasn't familiar with. And, Albany was at the time was pretty homogenous. And so it wasn't culture shock per se, but it was like, oh, everybody in the world wasn't, raised like I was, but not in a major shock way.
Okay, and you said you left Ithaca and you did what?
I came right to New York City.
What part?
I came right to Manhattan, actually. I found a cheap place. I lived in a couple neighborhoods that were cheap at the time. I lived on the Upper East Side, over by York Avenue, which at the time, and of course I was young. I was squeezing two people into a 600 square foot one bedroom. So it was cheap because we made sure it could be.
Right.
And then eventually I also lived way in uptown Manhattan for a while, around Dyckman Street, and then eventually moved to Hell's Kitchen, where I spent about 20 years. I always say I moved to Hell's Kitchen when people ask me if I needed my head examined to do that. It was not quite the gentrified neighborhood it is today. And now I live in Midtown East. So I've always lived in Manhattan, interestingly.
So a musician with a college degree is different from a musician, right?
Absolutely, right. And like one of the things you see, and I think people see this in a lot of the arts disciplines, is, there are people who just go right at it, right? They're not getting a degree. And, there were two schools of thought at the time, which was like, if you really want to play, just go play. Don't waste your time with a college degree because it's not additive. If you think you might want to teach, if you think you might want to do something else, practice a lot and get those degrees. And the same was true, I think, in our theater department. There were a few people who, spent a year and then left and just said, I actually don't want to waste 4 years of my life getting a college degree. I want to get working as a professional actor as soon as I can. Right. So both choices. And then interestingly, then some of them backed up in their 30s and 40s and got the college degree they didn't get. Right. So different paths. I would say, I was, at the time I was raised, it was, and in the kind of school I was in, it was just sort of presumed that you were going to go to college. And I don't think I frankly ever questioned it. I just went where I was told, and glad I did. And then it was when I got to New York that I was like, whoa, like some people have been practicing for 4 years while I was on campus and have been, actually gigging while I was, doing good stuff, but in a college setting. So
did you notice a difference skill wise as opposed, from you investing in the degree and the ones that didn't?
I skill level. Not sure it's skill as much as experience, right? Like 4 years of standing in front of audiences and performing live is a different kind of education than a more kind of what I'd call holistic, right? You're doing performing, obviously, while you're going to school, but it's not the only thing you're doing. You're taking music theory, and I'm taking history classes, and, so there's some important learning there where that experience of, just playing in front of audiences, performing in front of audiences, is a way that every day you're sort of testing what you're doing. It's a much more, I think, craft oriented, right? Like you really get good at this craft. Some of the stuff that's around it, you're not learning, which is fine. So I think that was the biggest difference I saw.
Do you, having a degree, did you immediately hey, I have a degree. Let me go put in my resume and get a job. How did that go?
I didn't. I wanted to figure out if there was kind of a role for me in the arts. And by the way, I kind of knew I wasn't going to be a performing musician. I say one of the important things I learned in college that I was good, but not great, right? Like when you're in a competitive, I was in a competitive school. And I will say one of those things that I think is actually really important when you go to college is, I remember sitting there with the other saxophonists that got accepted to Ithaca, and there were 6 of us. And there's that moment you realize, like, oh, every single one of us was the best saxophonist that ever was in our high school. We all played in the all-state band. We all did this. We all played solos with our band. And at a certain point, then you go, guess what? Only one of us is going to get to say that again, right? The other 5 are not going to get to say I was the best. But that being the best among 6 people who had a certain kind of raw material and were that good meant like just tons of work, right? Like, because that was going to be the difference. More so. And so I think, there was a point when I said, you know what, I don't want that aspect of music bad enough to do that, and that was kind of a dawning awareness through college. I loved it. I still do. But so when I got to New York, I think I was very much also just trying to figure out what I would do. So, I got a job my first job was at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, working at the front desk. And I worked evenings so that, during the day I could, meet other musicians, audition, for theater, just figure out what I could do. So, and after, I think it was probably about 5 years of doing that, and, did a bunch of stuff. I always say I did a bunch of stuff nobody would ever heard of, had a great time. And it was in my later 20s that I really started zeroing in and started teaching more intentionally. And that, interestingly, is when I really did discover a passion for teaching. And interestingly, I started by teaching elementary school kids music and theater. I ended up teaching middle school and high school kids. And now I'm teaching nonprofit management at Columbia, right? So I think probably somewhere in my late 20s, I discovered I was actually a teacher by nature. So
Where did you fit in reference to when the school systems started ending the music programs and such, when the defundings took place? Where were you? Yeah. Where were you in your journey?
I came after the defunding, so I kind of came into the desert, as I say, where arts had really not been in the schools for about 10 years in any intentional way, and which blew my mind, frankly, because I couldn't imagine getting to 4th grade and not being automatically offered a clarinet or a saxophone or a violin or something like that. I couldn't imagine being, in a school where they didn't do the 5th grade play, or like that didn't make any sense to me. And so, but I will say, teaching in the New York City school system was a huge eye opener for me. I was not from a wealthy area by any stretch, but it was a good, solid public school, right? And we had access to a lot of things. And as I started teaching around the 5 boroughs, the way Tada worked, I would end up sometimes teaching in 20 different schools over the course of a year. I might be going in for 10 sessions or teaching after school on Tuesday. So I really got to know the city by traveling around and teaching. And, that's when I became just more passionate, not just about the arts, but education in general, because, as I said, like the message is undeniable that no 2 kids in the city were getting the same education, and that was based on what neighborhood you lived in, right? It was like that. It was that obvious, you know. And as you travel around and you see, and you're meeting wonderful children in every place you're going, right? Like the kids are wonderful, but they just are literally not resourced the same. And you know, that I think is what drove a lot of my work about bringing more resource into public schools, especially with a focus on those that had less than others. And that really is, you know, drove a lot of the work I did over the next 25 years of my life.
And through your teaching, you were teaching music the whole time?
Music and theater. I was
And
able
theater.
to kind of do both.
What does teaching theater mean? What is that? What are you teaching? What is that?
Well, interestingly, you know, for kids, a lot of it is probably, you know, learning what I would call basic theater exercises, learning to focus, learning to be flexible, even do very beginning improv with kids. One of my favorite programs, I was at a school on the Lower East Side, and every year I'd go there twice a week. Still remember Tuesday and Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. And the kids would, over the course of the first half of the year, we would together write an original musical that they would then spend the second half of the year rehearsing and perform at the end of the school year. So for a lot of the arts in the schools, you know, it also is very kind of connected to curriculum. So, you know, the plays could be about, you know, events from history, a lot of different kind of topics that then also help them do their own research for the classes they were taking.
Do you still play?
Not enough. I do have, the piano is sitting there unused. I'm sorry to say, for a few years, but I've actually been toying with the idea of like warming my fingers up and getting back to it.
Okay, so you had made reference to this a couple of times in our conversation. So this interview is brought to us. The podcast is brought to us by the City Tutors.
Yep.
We are not-for-profit 501c3, and we offer free tutoring and mentorship to underserved communities. Let's put it that way. And we have amazing volunteers.
Yep.
Who were your mentors?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. You know, when I think back, I was lucky that I feel like a few teachers when I was in school kind of went that extra step and played a mentoring role for me. The chorus teacher in my high school and the band teacher. I mean, I actually, my band teacher, Enzo Cimino from high school, is in his mid 80s right now. I think he might be 90 even. And, you know, I've had the opportunity to see him and stay in touch. So those are the folks I think who really guided me, especially as I was thinking about my career and life, and they stayed in touch with me and were really wonderful supports to me. Okay.
And with tutoring, I guess every music lesson is like a tutoring session, right?
It is. Yeah, it's like tutoring. It's like coaching.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, coaching and mentoring and teaching all kind of walk hand in hand. It's just more about the quality and the nature of the relationship and what kind of information gets transferred, whether it's experience or technical knowledge or what's passing between the two of you. So, but yes. And, you know, I would say I was lucky in that I wasn't a student who needed extra tutoring. But when I did get to later in my career, when I was working at New York Cares, I mean, that was one of the biggest programs that we had. We together created what was the city's largest SAT preparation program.
Tell you this. I will tell you this.
Yes.
So city tutors, the city's tutors program, city mentors program. We say that this is something that Gary Rifkin told me, the executive director, when I was being onboarded to join the organization. He said that teachers supply the lessons,
Yep.
and tutors get the lessons supplied to them. The tutee tells the tutor what they're having trouble with,
Yep.
and what they need to work on. So he made a specific distinction about that. So typically, I guess when you are coming up and you're becoming a musician, you would typically go to a music instructor, and the instructor is telling you, this is what you need, and this is what you need to work on. And how often did you find it the other way around, where do young musicians say, hey, I know you teach music, can you help me with this? How often does that happen?
I'd say it does. I mean, what's interesting around music is, you're picking up literal physical skills, right? Like if you're learning to play the drums or the saxophone. I think what inspires people to ask for help is kind of what I would call material that they want help with, right? Like, I'd love to play this, I'm stuck in this section, or can I play this for you? But then, and I'm trying to think how often as a student I would bring the material myself. I would say most time it was pretty directed, right? That you would get help. You might sign up for private lessons if you were really passionate and there was, a particular issue that you weren't good at, or a particular facet that you weren't good at. But more often, I think it was pretty directive. Here's what you're going to work on this week. Good teachers, by the way, would also say, here's a bunch of pieces. Why don't you play through a few? We could decide together what you're going to work on. So they would be making sure that you felt good about the material.
Okay, so from a scholarly perspective, academic perspective, what would you say is the best advice that you have received?
Wow. This is what's popping to mind, and it's I guess I'll call it advice, but I remember I was very angry at her. My 11th grade English teacher gave me back my first paper, and she just had some red circles around different parts of it. And I said, what do you want me to do? And she said, I remember she said, do you have our grammar book? We were using Strunk and White, right? Do you have a Strunk and White? And I said, yes. And she said, so figure it out, right? She made me figure out what was wrong with the writing, rather than say, you have to fix this in this way. And I think that sense of trying to kind of, as I always say, untie the knot yourself as you're starting, and then reaching out when you feel like you've exhausted your effort, is advice I often give to students. I feel a lot of students come and say, what do you want me to do? And the answer is, I want you to learn, right? So where you ask for help in that process, I think, you don't want to be inefficient, right? You don't want to be the person who tries to fix your computer on your own for 6 hours because you don't open the manual. But you want to be the person who opens the manual and tries to figure it out before they call the help desk, right? And so I think that wasn't crafted as advice, but it was something that really, I think, was a kind of a mind shift for me in how I thought about my own participation in my own education.
Right. Okay. So so we go to the next step.
Yeah.
uh, educated, altruistic,
Yeah.
life well lived. What is the best advice that you can offer young people?
I think when I think about this, understandably, our school system is importantly getting ready for us to show up as adults in our society. And, education was originally designed to make sure we could all be employable, right? Like we were learning to do things that could get us a job and we could sustain ourselves and our families if we chose to start one. And I think um, that that is one aspect of a complete life, right? That our friendships, art, our hobbies, right? Like these are all parts of a well-lived life. And probably the most important, and you mentioned altruistic, which is true, is that, the research is really very clear that we are happiest as people when we are also in service of others, right? That we can take care of ourselves, but we can get like too in ourselves. And therefore, the ability to help others and step outside ourselves is the balance to making all of this a much more manageable kind of experience.
Okay, okay. Now, as you were telling your story, you you made it sound like a smooth journey. Did you stumble across any obstacles, any challenges?
Yeah, I think what was interesting for me, I mean, there were challenges along the entire journey, and a lot of those, were really key points in the journey when I wasn't sure if the path I was on was the one I wanted. Um, you know, Good old self-doubt, right? Like, am I good enough to do this thing I'm doing? And then getting in the middle of it and saying, I think I'm good enough, but do I want this? Um, Trying to figure out what's next, right? I always joke with people, 30 feels old when you're 30. It never feels old again. Right. But when you're 30, you're like, oh no, I'm 30 and I'm not, I don't know, president of a bank or the most famous musician in the world. What am I going to do?
All right.
And so, I think those points were, self-created in many ways. They're in my own head, but they were some of the biggest obstacles. And I guess if I were going to give advice, I would say, figuring out in life what obstacles are ones you formulate in your head versus the real ones is a really important thing to spend some time on, because the ones in your head you can fix because that's just about you, right? And accepting the obstacles and making them more manageable that you don't have control over. We lose family members, we fall in love, we fall out of love, right? Like good and bad things happen every day, some that we can do something about, some that we can't, right? So trying to not make more of those kind of self-inflicted, I would call, obstacles than you have to, is I think really important.
Okay. So we've gone through the spectrum. We started out with the companies that you worked for and ran, and programs
Yeah.
you ran, and your teaching and your upbringing. What did we leave out?
Uh-huh. Gosh, I was going to say, if there's anything in my life you haven't talked about, I'm not sure what it is. It's you've covered just a really great interview, but I think it's also falls under advice, like maybe a little bit, but I think a lot of my journey doesn't, I've learned to tell the story in a way, like you said, that it smoothly makes sense. But the journey was not smooth or I was never a person who said, this is what I want to do next and had my eye on it. I always say I discovered my next passion just by doing things and finding out that I was passionate about them or that I could build a passion for them. That wasn't something that was native to me. And so when I do, though, look at the connecting thread, to me, it's about purpose. It's about feeling identifying what your purpose is, your sense of purpose in this world. And a lot of that is why I feel like my last job worked so well for me, because this idea of being of service, trying to make the planet and the world a little bit better than the one I found and feeling like I can see myself in it, that was the connecting thread, right? And whether I tried to do that as a musician or a writer or a teacher, or in my nonprofit career, or even now teaching and coaching nonprofit leaders, it's about that. I've always been blessed that there's a sense of purpose in the work I do. So the work has almost never felt like work to me.
And that's what they say, right? If you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life.
Exactly.
And that sounds like what you did. And I love,
very lucky.
I love the journey. I love the journey. Now you said Albany, Ithaca, Manhattan.
Yep.
Do you travel? Do you go to foreign lands?
I would say in the pre-pandemic world, yes. Mostly traveled and enjoyed vacationing so far in the US, but I've been to Brazil, I've been to Costa Rica a couple times. I was to Europe when I was younger. Certainly, hit Canada and Mexico because you're kind of on the same continent. But actually been talking a lot about, traveling more now in the future.
When you traveled as a young musician, did you have to go to the clubs and try to sit in on a session or a band or a group or something like that? Did you take that journey?
No, by the time I got to the city, I knew that wasn't the journey for me. I went, I enjoyed, I loved music, but it wasn't really my journey.
Okay. So I was as you were talking, I asked you the question, did we leave anything out? And I said, well, maybe we left that out. Let's see where this goes.
I love it.
But no, that's great. That's great. And again, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you joining me.
Great being here.
Did you leave anything out about food insecurity? Like, is there any other thing I need to?
Nope, I gave you the whole lesson. I gave you the whole lesson.
You gave me 3 or 4 bullet points that I'm going to use. I'm going to use. What can I say? What can I say to make me sound absolutely informed? Like, what's the most important thing I need to know about food insecurity? How we can help? What's the call to action? How do we fix it? How do we solve it?
Well, there's a few different ways. Yeah, but I'd say there are a few big ways, and this is what we can do with all social services, right? We can get in the trenches, right? We can, we can work at the food pantry, we can donate to food pantries, we can donate to food causes, and then we can educate ourselves on the policy issues that lead to food insecurity, right? Food insecurity is often the last thing we see in a path that has included not underemployment, right? Or and it could be lack of education, therefore underemployment, right? So we find ourselves not being able to support ourselves and our family. So it's thinking about understanding what's happening in terms of policy and law that might be exacerbating that problem, right? Because if I'm unable to get a job, if I'm unable to complete my education, I may find myself unable to support my family, right? And myself. So those are the 2 things I would say: get in the trenches and then educate yourself on issues around policy and advocacy.
Gary, that was it. That was what we left out.
You got it.
I'm going to sound well informed. I'm going to sound brilliant.
Exactly. And you are. So that's a good thing.
I owe it all to you, and I thank you. Thank you so much.